They say that with great change often comes great trepidation and fear. Nowhere is this more evident than the whole healthcare debate in the United States. It's funny listening to some of the arguments made now for utterly absurd things like death panels. Because those are the same arguments that were used 45 years ago here in Canada when we introduced our public healthcare system. They weren't true, but it scared a lot of people into being afraid of change. The whole argument against public health care in the United States is more or less based upon the fallacy that if you have private insurance, they'll cover you. They cover minor things that won't cost them a whole lot of money, but if you have someone in your family gets cancer, or you get cancer, or somebody has a major accident or some other serious medical event, even though you've paid those extortionate rates for your insurance, the insurance company will still find some minor, pathetic little excuse, like being treated for a hangnail when you were 12, or having, breaking your toe when you were 15, or being treated for a lung infection when you were 18. And they'll use that as an excuse to say, you didn't list down a pre-existing condition. Therefore, fuck you. You're not covered. Goodbye. Go away and die. A publicly run healthcare system would preclude that from happening, because everyone would at least get the equal level of care, regardless of their economic standing within the community. In the States, your per capita healthcare costs are over $8,000 a year. Here in Canada, they're just a little bit under $3,000. And with our public healthcare system, Canadians live on average 4 to 5 years longer than Americans. Because here, if you need care, you can go get your care. You don't need to worry about, will insurance cover this, or how am I going to pay this bill? The people arguing against it are the funniest. You have the ultra right-wing conservatives who are just terrified of any kind of change, and you have their toadies like Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh and Bill O'Reilly and all those clowns who've got enough money that they can afford to basically walk into a hospital and buy their own treatment if they want. Hell, Rush Limbaugh makes more than enough money he could buy himself a hospital if he wanted to. And then you've got the lackeys underneath them, the people like the Tea Partiers, most of whom strike me as being little more than nearly over-the-hill middle-agers, than nearly middle-aged baby boomers who are terrified of change and upset with the fact that history and life has basically passed them by. When you see their protests on TV, ranting and raving against healthcare and this and that and everything else, they're always screaming about taxes and death panels and all these other things. They say, I want my country back. In the same way a 4-year-old does at Walmart when that child is screaming for a toy. They don't realize they haven't lost their country. They're just scared to death of the idea of change. They don't like change. And most of them are too ignorant or too stupid to realize that the organization that created the whole Tea Party movement is essentially bought and paid for by private interests. They can never make a cogent argument for anything of any kind against this. All they keep pointing to is taxes will go up. This will happen. That will happen. They compare Obama to. They will say in the same breath, Obama is a fascist. He's a communist fascist, which makes absolutely no sense because it's impossible to be two things at once. Either he's one or the other, or neither. Because communist is like what they have in China or Russia, where the government, or used to have in Russia, where the government runs everything. Fascist, on the other hand, is the exact other end of the society, of the political spectrum. That's what Hitler was. He was a fascist. He was an ultra-conservative fascist. Mussolini, ultra-conservative fascist. Franco, same deal. They were all ultra-conservative. They preyed upon people's fear of change and fear of things that were different for control. And once they succeeded in turning people against each other, then they were able to exercise full control over that society. All the arguments made against a public healthcare system, a lot of them are silly. There will not be any death penalties. That argument was tried here in Canada 40 plus years ago when the idea was introduced, and the man who introduced it received phone calls from quote-unquote concerned citizens who would play tapes of screaming babies and then accuse him of wanting to kill babies. It didn't work. This plan still passed. We have universal health care in Canada now. Have for 40 years, and to a degree it does work. The fear of change is an amazing thing. People still have this deep part of their brain left over from Neanderthal times, where that tells them to be afraid of anything that is different. To be afraid of the guy over in the next cave because he's different from you, or to be afraid of an idea that's different from yours. The whole idea of what is trying to be done with healthcare reform in the United States is to progress your society into the 21st century. You can't have a purely and unadulterated capitalist system. It just simply doesn't work. It will eventually fall in on itself, as what happened with the subprime mortgage disaster and the meltdown of the American economy that gave the rest of the world a bad case of, well, let's put it this way: when the American economy gets a cold, the rest of the world gets pneumonia. That's the result of a lack of control and regulation. At the very least, there should be regulations on what health insurance companies in the States can do and how they treat people. They should be required to give a fair and equal consideration to everybody, no matter what their place is in society and what their position is in life. Just because it's irrational to be afraid of change that can help you. But unfortunately for a lot of people, irrationality seems to control them. It's sad but true.